Welcome back, clinical learners. Let's just jump right into it. Today, we're unpacking Otto Fenichel's fascinating framework on how one single internal conflict can branch out into incredibly specific symptomatic pathways. As clinicians, we see baffling presentations all the time, right? Well, this explainer is our deep dive into Fenichel's material to figure out exactly why that happens, and we're looking at it strictly through a sharp clinical lens. Okay, let's ground this complex theory in our actual day-to-day residency reality. Picture three distinct clinical mysteries sitting in your waiting room. Patient A desperately wants to act, to do something, but their mind or body just seemingly locks up and says, cannot. Then you have patient B, who completely avoids a specific everyday situation, let's say getting into an elevator, because of this intense, paralyzing fear. And finally, patient C. They present with what looks exactly like a neurological symptom, but when you run the tests, there's absolutely no corresponding explanatory neurological lesion. To really master the intrapsychic mechanisms at play here, we're going to follow a strict pedagogical roadmap today. We'll start with the core premise, then systematically break down inhibition, phobia, and conversion, before wrapping up with a really crucial look at primary and secondary gains. Let's start with Section 1, the core premise. One conflict, three different pathways. Now, what's really fascinating about Fenichel's theory is how incredibly dynamic the ego's defenses are. You can have the exact same underlying internal conflict, but the clinical result can be entirely different. It all comes down to the defense pathway the ego chooses in order to survive the pressure. And as you can see, those choices map out as either inhibition, phobia, or conversion. So let's move to our first mechanism, inhibition, and see how this explains patient A. Clinically speaking, inhibition is when the ego reduces or completely halts a specific function. Why? Because that function has somehow acquired a dangerous unconscious meaning. If we look at its developmental origin, this is basically the ego's primitive attempt to just avoid pain. Instead of fighting, the ego defensively renounces the capability altogether. It literally boils down to this incredibly simple yet powerful formula. If doing X activates danger, stop doing X. That's it. The ego sacrifices a function, maybe the ability to move an arm or to speak, just so it doesn't have to face an explosive underlying conflict. Let's look at a simplified, non-speculative causal chain for patient A to really see this intrapsychic mechanism in action. Say the trigger is a deep urge of anger, right? An action that, unconsciously, is strictly forbidden. This urge triggers severe, unbearable anxiety. So what does the ego do? It slams on the brakes. You get motor inhibition. The body literally refuses to move. We don't need any wild, far-fetched sexual interpretations here. We can clearly see the psychological conflict manifesting, purely as a physical stoppage. What's the clinical implication for us? Well, for patient A, we can't just fixate on the apparent paralysis. We have to look phenomenologically at what is actually happening and ask, what exactly becomes impossible for the patient when this function stops? We have to trace it back and treat that hidden, forbidden conflict, not just the physical symptom. All right, let's shift gears to phobia, displacing internal danger, and see what's going on with patient B. In Fenichel's framework, a phobia occurs when an internal danger is displaced and attached to an external situation, which then allows the ego to actively avoid it. Developmentally, this is essentially a regression to childhood. The ego feels overwhelmed and is desperately looking for an illusion of external protection against its own unacceptable internal drives. I mean, think about the clever, tactical advantage the ego gets here. It is literally impossible to escape from your own mind, right? You can't outrun an internal psychological conflict. But it is remarkably easy to just walk away from a physical elevator. The ego projects the danger outward, transforming an inescapable internal conflict into a highly avoidable external object. Let's break down this intrapsychic mechanism step by step. First, an unconscious internal danger arises. Second, the ego triggers an anxiety signal as an early warning. Third, this massive displacement happens, shifting the danger onto an external object. And fourth, the actual avoidance behavior is executed. Anxiety is the signal, displacement is the tool, and avoidance is the final clinical result. It temporarily relieves that dammed-up tension perfectly. The absolute key clinical implication for patient B is realizing that the phobic object, the elevator, is merely a substitute. Treating the phobia isn't just about external desensitization. We have to trace those associative connections backward to uncover and treat the original displaced drive. Now, let's dive into conversion conflicts body language. This is the fascinating and honestly often misunderstood pathway taken by patient C. Conversion happens when a repressed psychological conflict gains a distorted expression through physical bodily functions. This mechanism originates deep in the archaic ego, a very primitive developmental stage where physical discharge syndromes completely take over purposeful voluntary action. Every resident needs to underline this quote. In classical psychoanalytic theory, a conversion symptom is not just some random overflowing emotional static. It is a highly specific physical representation of a repressed thought, one that functions as the actual body language of the conflict. Theoretically, we can translate it back into words. Mapping this out, we see a failure in the ego's self-mastery. First, there's repression of an instinctual conflict. Then, the normal control apparatus fails, and the ego loses mastery over specific bodily motility. Because that psychological energy is blocked and has nowhere to go, it leaps into the physical sphere, resulting in an archaic physical discharge syndrome. That leap is exactly what produces the striking clinical presentation we see in patient C. But listen, we need to set a very firm, modern guardrail here. In today's clinical landscape, patient C's presentation must be understood through the lens of functional neurological symptom disorder, or FND. Please do not assume that every single unexplained symptom has some deep, symbolic, psychoanalytic meaning. Modern clinical neurology and psychiatry are our absolute baseline before we even think about exploring psychodynamics. Okay, on to our final section, primary and secondary gains. Now that we know how a symptom forms, we need to look at how the ego adapts to it once it's there. It is incredibly vital to separate these two concepts. Primary gain is all about why the symptom formed in the first place. The symptom directly helps manage the internal conflict. Secondary gain, however, refers to the practical advantages that emerge after the symptom exists. We're talking about things like getting extra care from family or a sudden reduction in daily life demands. The ego basically makes a virtue out of the necessity of illness. I cannot emphasize this next point enough in our daily practice. Secondary gain is absolutely not the same as malingering, and it does not have to be conscious. As modern clinicians, you cannot dismiss a patient or accuse them of faking just because they seem to derive some external benefit from their illness. This is an automatic adaptation that often operates entirely under the radar of the patient's own awareness. To wrap up our analysis today, I want to leave you with a profound psychodynamic question that should completely change how you view every inexplicable symptom in the clinic. The question is not, is the symptom real? The question is, how does the symptom function in the overall psychological system? Focus on its adaptive function rather than constantly judging its authenticity. Mastering the intricate dynamics we covered today perfectly sets us up for our next clinical challenge. Join us for our upcoming analysis in Episode 9, where we will push these boundaries even further and tackle a part of Fenichel's work that requires very careful reading through a modern lens: organ neurosis and psychosomatic theory. Until then, keep looking for the clinical meaning behind the symptoms.